When it comes to weapons in D&D, not all of them were created equal, and many are considered to be mechanically subpar. On top of this, the rulebooks don't provide us much detail on these weapons, leaving us to fill in the gaps of how our weapons look and feel. Due to this lack of information, I'd like to go through and examine all the weapons of D&D to answer: what is this weapon, both in history and in D&D? How is it different from the other weapons available? And does it need to be made better, and how can we do so? For today's video, let's look at the weapon of choice for knights in history and fiction: the lance. The definition for a lance can be a bit unclear at times, so let me try to clarify things. The lance is generally defined as a type of spear, mostly used on horseback. So if a spearman gets on a horse, is he now wielding a lance? If he dismounts, is he a spearman? Or is he a pikeman? Well, much like when we discussed the dagger, all lances are a type of spear, but not all spears are going to be lances. Generally, a lance measures from 2.5 to 5.5 meters long, and utilizes the momentum of a cavalry charge to thrust the end of the lance into the enemy. In terms of form, the lance would either be couched under the rider's arm or held overarm during the charge, though underarm seems to have been the more common historical usage. Despite their popularity and prominence in the Middle Ages, lances have been around since the ancient era and were widespread throughout East Asia, the Middle East, and Northern Africa. Among their roster of polearms, the ancient Chinese wielded the pi, translated as either the sword staff or long lance. Essentially a short sword attached to a long stick, the pi was believed to have been used by infantry and cavalry from the early Shang dynasty to the end of the Han dynasty in 220 AD. Further west, cavalry developments in Central Asia and the Middle East made the lance a prominent weapon for many ancient empires. The nomads of the Central Asian steppes were known for developing and spreading many breakthroughs in cavalry warfare, from early chariots to the development of cataphracts. Armed with early lances and bows, these heavily armored cataphracts specialized in breaking through enemy lines, and thanks to war, trade, and migrations, their use spread further and further west from the 700s to the 500s BC. The Greeks first encountered these cataphracts during the Greco-Persian Wars of the 5th century BC. While the heavy armor of cataphracts were shunned by Hellenistic forces, their light cavalry still took advantage of military reforms to utilize the lance. During the reign of Philip II of Macedon, around the 300s BC, he improved the Macedonian army, creating the famous phalanx formation and equipping them with long sarissa pikes. The cavalry under Philip, and later his son Alexander the Great, would utilize shorter versions of the sarissa pike on horseback, turning them into light lancer cavalry. Thanks to research by Minor Markle and Peter Connolly, it's believed that the cavalry sarissa could have been between 4 and 5 meters long, with shorter variants being better in prolonged melee. Despite Markle and Connolly's disagreement on whether the sarissa was a primary weapon for cavalry of the time, they both agreed that the cavalry sarissa was likely used in one hand, as wielding it in two hands like an infantry pike would dismount the rider when striking an opponent at full charge. Nicholas Secunda, head of the Department of Mediterranean Archaeology at the University of Gdansk, argues that the Macedonian cavalry spear was more properly classed as a ziston. Made of Cornell wood, the ziston was significantly shorter than the sarissa, measuring only 3.5 to 4.2 meters long, and possessed a wider spearhead. Secunda also notes that ancient Macedonians may have used the term sarissa to broadly refer to any spear, greatly frustrating historians and archaeologists everywhere. Whether it was a sarissa or ziston, the Macedonian sarissa bearers would be placed on the outer flanks of a battle line, charging forward against enemy cavalry to break through the line, as they did against the Persians during the Battle of Gaugamela in 331 BC. After the fall of Alexander the Great, one of his successor kingdoms, the Seleucid Empire, began widely adopting the cataphract and their lances into their armies, as did the Parthians, who drove the Seleucids out of Persia in the 2nd century BC. After driving out one Western invader, however, the Parthians had a new enemy to face: the Romans. From 53 BC to 217 AD, Rome and Parthia battled many times over control of the East, with Parthia deploying their cataphracts against Rome's infamous heavy infantry. As a result of this lingering period of exposure to cataphracts, the Romans deployed both native and mercenary units throughout the empire, from Asia Minor all the way up to Britain, most famously using the Sarmatian Lancers. Despite the fall of the Roman Empire at the start of the Middle Ages, the use of heavily armored lancer cavalry survived and later thrived in Europe. The remains of the Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantines, continued the tradition of fielding cataphract units, equipping them with a 2.5-meter-long Greek lance referred to as a kontos or kontarion. While the scourge of Vikings in Western Europe delayed them from discovering the untold power of a guy on a horse with a really big stick, lancers quickly began to dominate medieval warfare, starting in the 10th and 11th centuries. The power and strength of lance cavalry posed a serious problem to many militaries of the time. Their answer? Take a bunch of guys, give them lances of their own, and have them point their lances at enemy cavalry. Indeed, the pike was the answer Western Europe was looking for, and while we'll get to the pike in its own video, its purpose as a direct counter to lancer cavalry is likely one of the reasons it was adopted so widely in the late Middle Ages. From the 14th to 16th centuries, lancers and pikemen were so effective that they not only became a staple of every Western army of the time, but they also became highly sought-after mercenaries. Off the battlefield, the medieval tactics of heavy cavalry developed into its own pastime: jousting. From knights to nobles to even kings, jousts would be organized for the nobility to prove their bravery through martial strength. Originating in the early Middle Ages, jousts started as organized duels, and were not just limited to lance combat. These jousts were much rougher, with the goal to incapacitate your enemies so that you could take their horses, arms, or ransom them. With the greater adoption of chivalry in the High Middle Ages, jousts became more regulated, with the focus less on defeating your opponent to sell him back to his family, and more on gaining prestige through honorable combat. As firearms continued to develop in the 17th and 18th centuries, the popularity of lancer cavalry began to decline. While Renaissance captains like Sir Roger Williams promoted the lance, others shunned it in favor of the pistol, which boasted greater armor piercing, handiness, and general utility. In that same period, the adoption of pike and shot tactics countered the power of a direct cavalry charge. Over time, traditional heavy cavalry simply became more expensive to maintain than light cuirassiers. As such, many Western European militaries traded their lances for pistols, with the exception of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, who retained their famous winged hussars well into the 18th century. After the 18th century, with pikes and body armor being replaced by muskets and uniforms, there was a revival of the lance in Western Europe. During the Napoleonic Wars, almost all European powers reintroduced lances to their cavalry brigades. The lances used in this period measured between 2 and 3 meters in length, and once employed in initial charges, sabers would be drawn for close combat. Of all the Lancers recruited during that time, the Poles were the main source of recruitment, and Polish Lancers served in the Austrian, Prussian, Russian, and French armies, most famously in Napoleon's French Imperial Guard. It wasn't until the years leading up to the First World War that serious discussions about retiring the lance were had. Still in use during the outbreak of the war, initial skirmishes with Lancer cavalry proved the weapon to be ineffective against constantly improving firearms technology, as well as the later introduction of trench warfare. The cavalry branches that still maintained them by the end of the war discarded them entirely, save for ceremonial occasions, and by the outbreak of World War II, the lance had disappeared from the battlefield. In the modern day, the lance is mostly used in jousting reenactments, popular in North America and Europe at Renaissance fairs. It also got picked up as a casual hobby for many, with jousting becoming the official sport of Maryland in 1962. Lances are sometimes used as flagstaffs by mounted police forces, but for the most part, the lance now serves as an icon of medieval warfare. In D&D, the lance is described as a long member of the spear family of polearms, specially designed for use in mounted combat. They generally consisted of a long shaft made of tough wood, with a sharp iron head meant to penetrate armor. Present since 1st edition, older versions of the lance cost between 6 and 20 gold pieces, weighed between 2.3 and 9.1 kilograms, and dealt between 1d4 and 1d8 piercing damage depending on the type of lance being used. In 5th edition, the lance costs 10 gold pieces, weighs 2.7 kilograms, deals 1d12 piercing damage, and has the reach and special weapon properties. As one of the 2 weapons in 5th edition that has the special weapon property, the lance is, well, special. It has the highest possible damage dice with 1d12, a 10-foot melee reach, and, unlike other reach weapons, it does not have the heavy property, meaning that smaller races can use it quite effectively. However, the special property states that it requires 2 hands to use on foot, and it has disadvantage to attack enemies within 5 feet of you, making it less effective once enemies close the distance. Weirdly enough, despite it fitting thematically, this is not a restriction on any of the other reach weapons we'll examine, such as the pike. So, as a weapon option, is the lance good or bad? Well, it depends on how you use it. Unlike many of the other weapons of 5th edition, the lance has already been given a hyper-specific role, something that I've been trying to do with all the weapons in this video series. If used on foot or against enemies that swarm you, the lance has some trade-offs that make it objectively worse than the pike, in which case you'd be better off switching to a backup weapon. As a mounted weapon, however, the lance allows riders to deal massive damage from 10 feet away while wielding it in one hand. In fact, it's the only mundane weapon that can deal that much damage with one hand, leaving the other hand open to hold a shield. The lance isn't bad. It's just niche. The whole point of this Weapons We Wield series is to give weapons more purpose beyond just their stats, and the lance already checks that box as a weapon meant to be used while mounted. That being said, even though it has this role as a mounted weapon, it is by no means perfect at fulfilling this role, and many tweaks have been done to it to try to offset the negatives that keep people from trying it out. So, while we're not going to try to fix the lance per se, let's look at some ways to slightly improve it in the hopes of getting more players to be willing to use it. My first suggestion to improve the lance in D&D is to reinstate the lance's double damage while mounted. In 3rd edition, the lance was a two-handed reach weapon that dealt 1d8 piercing damage, though you could wield it in one hand while mounted. That edition also stated that a lance deals double damage when used from the back of a charging mount. While the charge action was removed in 5th edition, reintroducing the ability for the lance to be used in a devastating charge not only reflects the historical use of the weapon, but gives mounted characters an added benefit when using the lance as intended. If we wanted to introduce this as a weapon property to the lance in 5th edition, I'd actually take inspiration from the Centaur's charge feature, stating, if a mounted character wielding the lance moves at least 30 feet straight toward a target, and then hits it with a lance attack on the same turn, the target takes an extra 1d12 piercing damage. With this weapon feature, characters could be rewarded for taking advantage of the mobility a mount provides, moving in and out of melee, impaling goblins on the end of their lance. My second suggestion on how to improve the lance is to add a weapon feature that makes the lance able to knock enemies down or even knock them off their own mounts. Whether in jousting or actual combat, a lance strike at full charge has enough weight and momentum to impale enemies, knock them fully off their feet, and even dismount enemy riders. But in 5th edition, there isn't a mechanic in combat that allows us to emulate momentum. When looking at potential solutions, one that I found was in the 1D&D Weapon Mastery's Unearthed Arcana, which gives weapons an extra feature that certain classes can use. That UA introduces the Topple Weapon Mastery, which states, if you hit a creature with this weapon, you can force the creature to make a Constitution saving throw, with a DC of 8 plus your proficiency bonus, plus the ability modifier used to make the attack roll. On a failed save, the creature has the prone condition. Now, when I suggested this for the halberd, some of you in the comments made a good point that this saving throw should probably be strength or dexterity instead of constitution, since those ability scores better reflect the ability to stay on your feet or dodge the initial trip or topple attack. Personally, I like the idea of having it be a dexterity saving throw, but I could definitely see arguments for strength as well. My third and final suggestion on how to improve the lance would be to actually improve the mechanics and implementation of mounted combat. As a weapon intended to be used by cavalry, the lance generally suffers from the fact that mounted combat gets overlooked in most games, simply because it's reliant on the dungeon master to create wilderness encounters where mounted combat can work. Fitting a large warhorse down a dungeon hallway, for example, tends to introduce more problems than it solves. Further, while creative DMs might realize they can put goblins on top of wargs or direwolves to create mounted combat encounters, there aren't a lot of monster stat blocks that innately encourage or implement mounted combat. On top of creating scenarios where mounted combat would even work, the way it's currently written within the turn order and action economy of the game is finicky, and more than likely requires the DM to handwave a couple rules about turn order to make it work the way the players intend. Now, redesigning the entirety of mounted combat would likely be a video in its own right, so I'm not going to get into how the game doesn't take momentum or charges into account in combat. All I'm saying is that if we want the lance as a weapon intended for mounted combat to be better used and implemented by players in D&D, we need to make mounted combat more accessible for players to do so. However, these are just a few of my own suggestions on how to improve the lance in D&D. If we were to leave the weapon as is, it would still function as a good mounted weapon to use on an initial charge before swapping to a different weapon for close combat. Sure, it's niche, and it's certainly not going to be used by every character in every campaign, but it has a dedicated role where it excels as the choice for players that want to emulate the knights of old. With that, we come to the end of today's video on the lance. The go-to weapon for mounted combat, the lance is very special when compared to the other reach weapons in D&D. While not bad on its own, it could still use some tweaks that encourage more players and DMs to emphasize mounted combat in their games. However, what I want to know is, what do you think of the lance? Do you think it's fine as it is now? Did you like some of the suggestions I put forward? Or did you have your own ideas on how to improve the lance in D&D? You can let me know down in the comments, or you can discuss it on the Alt-Roll Discord using the link in the description. If you want to support Alt-Roll, you can visit our Ko-fi link in the description to leave a one-time or recurring donation. And make sure to like, subscribe, and hit that bell icon to be notified when our videos go live. However, that's all I had for you. Thank you all for watching, make sure to have a great rest of your day, and I'll see all of you next time.